Thanks so much for tuning in again to this special segment with Pastor Lee Cummings from Radiant Church in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We're unpacking Isaiah chapter 62. Lee, thanks again for being with us, brother.
Such a joy, Scott.
In our previous segment, we talked about how the Lord is looking for men and women to pray, and actually that he's appointed men and women to pray for Israel. We talked about the power of the word if my people, that the Lord is waiting for us to cry out to him. It blesses his heart as a father when we do that. In the same way, it blesses our heart when our kids cry out. But we spoke about that within the context of Isaiah chapter 62, which is an amazing chapter. I know it's one that the Lord's put on your heart. So I would love for you just to lead us through this chapter. And what do you feel the Lord is speaking to us today where Isaiah 62 is concerned?
Well, I love Isaiah 62 because the whole chapter is this prophetic, almost telescopic view of God's kind intentions to save Israel. It's his salvation of Zion. It's him stating unequivocally that no matter what, and the Old Testament is full of these cycles of disobedience and idolatry and judgment and scattering. And in the midst of that, God raises up these prophets, these prophetic voices that are calling the people of Israel back to obedience and also putting God's heart out there saying, I don't want to see you go into judgment. I don't want this for you. What I want is you to believe in me, to be faithful to me, and for me to then fulfill all of my covenant promises to you. And Isaiah 62 is just this beautiful eschatological promise that at the culmination of so many of these times of disobedience and idolatry, and God even uses this idea throughout the Old Testament about them being like a wife who's committed adultery against him, but yet his heart is still towards her. He's still going to go after her. And Isaiah 62 is this. He starts off by just saying, for Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. And for Jerusalem's sake, I will not be quiet. I mean, God could, just think about it. I mean, it's true in all of our lives individually, but Israel as his covenant people, God could have just gone silent. And there's nothing worse in a relationship than silence. Oftentimes people will say that hate is the opposite of love, but actually the polar opposite of love is indifference.
Wow.
Hatred is very closely connected to love because it's connected to emotional. It's an emotional connection. The worst thing that can happen in a relationship is somebody goes silent, where they just ghost you. They're not responding to you anymore. I don't want to talk to you. Phrases like, I've said all that needs to be said. We don't have anything more to say.
Wow.
Think about that. But when God is looking at Zion, Israel, he says, I will not keep silent.
The remarkable thing about that is, as you said previously, Israel deserved for God to be silent. I mean, if you can imagine the maker of heaven and earth choosing one people, yet those people flee from him, serve other gods.
Over and over and over again.
Over and over and over again, which, I've heard it say, as Israel goes, so goes the church. This really gives hope for all of us who deserve God to turn his back on us. Yet on the cross, he says, forgive them. They know not what they do. That we've got a God who is ever desirous to have interaction with us. And if we're not hearing him, it's not because he's not speaking to us. So I will not keep silent. That's really, really beautiful. And if there's a people that deserved silence, it was Israel. I want you to continue on, but I'm just blessed by this already. Because look, the Lord's heart is towards Zion because his heart is towards the nations. He chose one nation so that every nation can be saved, right? That's what Israel's call was.
That was their election.
Yeah.
It wasn't that they would just keep it to themselves, but it was that they would be a light to the rest of the nations of the earth. And, this isn't an Israel problem. This isn't a Jewish problem of sin and disobedience. This is a human problem. And it's the whole reason why God elected Israel to begin with. That's why he selected Abram. Abram he was a pagan. He was, from Ur of the Chaldees. He's according to rabbis, his father was an idol maker.
Right.
I mean, he has no background. He doesn't have a Bible degree. He's not a covenant theologian. I mean, he's not any of these things, but God selected him and elected him for the purpose of dealing with this very issue of man's propensity to be unfaithful to God.
Wow.
But it's the perfect background, because in man's unfaithfulness and propensity to be unfaithful to God, it's God's opportunity to show his propensity to be continually faithful to us.
I love it. We're living in an age where there are churches that are writing off Israel because they don't think that Israel deserves God's promises. They say, the promises that the Lord made where Israel is concerned are now now the church owns them, and Israel is no longer the recipient of those promises, because we're looking as an earthly man or woman would look. You don't deserve this, so therefore we're going here. God never looks that way.
Yeah, and if Israel can't keep God's faithfulness, how in the world do we think we're going to keep it?
Yeah,
I mean, I really think replacement theology is one of the. I know Jesus-loving, godly people that subscribe to that.
Wow.
And so I don't want to label them as not brothers and sisters, but I think the ideology behind it is so destructive and may I even say demonic, because God he says it right here, I'm not going to keep silent until her righteousness goes forth as brightness and her salvation as a burning torch. He says, look, it's going to happen. Yeah. I will not relent. I will not give up. And here's what I will tell you about God. God gets what he wants.
God gets what he wants.
God gets what he wants. And what he wants is he wants his covenant people. He wants their, not just back in the land. I mean, right now we can see Israel in the land since 1948 and in Jerusalem since 67, but they're still in the land in unbelief. I mean, there's kind of two sides to this road. There's the replacement theology side that says all the Old Testament promises that God made to Israel now apply to the church. Israel's kind of been written off, and they look at Israel after the flesh today and they say, well, that's just coincidental. There's nothing special about it. But there's the other side of the coin, that they look at Israel in the land today and say, well, Jews have returned from all over the world after 2,000 years. They're back in the land. This is the fulfillment of it. Yeah. But the reality is that even to this day, for the most part, Israel is dwelling in the land. Jews are dwelling in the land in unbelief. This is still yet future, because he says, I'm not going to relent until I see her righteousness go forth as brightness and her salvation as a burning torch. That burning torch right now is not burning. They're still in a state of unbelief. Yeah. There's still there are messianic movements and congregations and wonderful Jewish brothers and sisters in Christ that are in the body of Christ. But for the most part, there's still that blindness to the gospel. And that's what is so beautiful about this whole chapter, is because God's saying, I'm not going to relent. I'm not going to give up. I get what I want. This is what's going to happen. And it's going to be in large part based on what verse 6 says, that I'm going to raise up watchmen, prayer warriors, intercessors in the most significant time in human history leading unto Israel's salvation that are going to pray and join in with me and not give up either. So you got on one hand, God saying, I'm not going to be quiet until her salvation comes. And he says, and then I'm going to raise up watchmen on the wall who don't give me any rest until this happens. Until.
I don't know that I've ever correlated those two verses together. It's beautiful. We've got a very patient God who's willing to wait for his purposes to be accomplished. And we've got a very impatient church, by and large, who are looking for quick fixes, and when our prayers aren't answered, immediately somehow either say, God doesn't care, or our prayers are not being heard, or we're not praying rightly. And bro, if this is all we did and we shut this down right now, I'm happy, because this is amazing. This word until, when Isaiah answers the call of God, I think it's Isaiah 5 or 6, who will go for us? Yeah. And Isaiah says, 6, here am I, send me. What do you want me to say? And he gives Isaiah a not so popular word. Tell them they have eyes and they don't see, ears and they don't hear. Lord, how long? And God says, until.
Until.
The Lord is very desirous for his purposes to come to completion.
Yes.
And the amazing thing is although he can do it himself, he looks to us.
Yes.
And that is humbling and quite awesome to think that we are part of God's plan where Israel's salvation is concerned.
Another place where the word until is used is in the Gospels. I think it's in Matthew where it says, I think it's Matthew or Luke, where Jesus teaching on the end of the age.
Yeah.
He says until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled.
Wow.
And he's talking about Jerusalem will be trampled under feet by Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled.
Yeah.
It's as if God has a timeline. It's as if God knows what he's doing and that he's bringing all things to completion. And what I think is so destructive, I want to get back to that replacement theology piece real quick, is replacement theology steals the zeal of the church stepping into the role of praying and provoking Israel unto jealousy.
Wow.
And that's the whole focus of the New Testament. Ephesians 3 is very clear. Just about, look, Paul says, I understand the mystery. You guys know I understand the mystery, how God's taking two and putting them into one. And how he's demonstrating through the church to the principalities and the powers of the air, his manifold wisdom. Well, what's the manifold wisdom? It's that in all of these things, here's the church, here's Israel, here's all their struggles, here's the wars, here's the gospel going forth. And in what looks like chaos, in one generation, God's bringing it all like strands of a fabric together. And it's going to result in the church becoming the greatest advocate, not the enemy, but the advocate for Israel in their most difficult hour. And God fulfilling the promises of Isaiah 62, where he sees the salvation of Israel and their righteousness actually come to pass. And God's fervent. He's moving even when we don't see him moving. But there's going to come an until moment where we go, oh, we're living in that until moment.
We're living in it. I
think we're close.
I do too. We're very young. We're both in our mid and upper 50s. In my relatively brief lifetime, I don't know that I have seen so much hatred and animosity towards Israel, both from within the church in a crazy way, and even from outside of the church, that it just seems to me, before Israel was birthed as a nation, at least in the world's eyes, they went through like this incredible time of testing, World War II, and the enemy's desire to annihilate Israel, which is a biblical pattern.
It's ancient history.
It's ancient history. Ancient hatred, whether it was Pharaoh, Haman, Hamas, Hitler, whatever it may be, people want to see Israel wiped off the map. But in each of those seasons, God supernaturally does something. So whether it was with Pharaoh, the Lord parted the sea, he brings them out. Whether it's with Haman, he raises up, his people to cry out and to speak and to share. Whether it's with Herod, who wanted all of the Jewish children born, Jesus comes. We're in another, and maybe even the final one. I don't know. But never before have I felt the burden to be the people who will contend until. And I think all forces of hell are against us where that's concerned. So, bro, keep on going. But thank you. Thank you for this.
Well, and I think that until what that sets us up is we have to ask the question, what's God saying today?
Yeah.
And I really believe, here's where I'm hopeful. I have seen the hatred of Israel, but I've seen also a stirring in a new generation of leaders and people in the church to once again, not just be Zionists. I think there's benefit to that politically, but actually taking their place as watchmen on the wall. God is raising up intercessors. He's raising up intercessors, young and old, who all of a sudden have their eyes like tractor beams fixed on Israel because they're beginning to understand what is at play. Like, we're beginning to see the pieces of the puzzle. It's kind of like that, a Tetris game. And beginning to see when this slides. And what's happening is there's an awakening happening in young people where they're beginning to put their eyes back on Israel. And stir this verse of give him no rest until he establishes Jerusalem and makes it a praise in the earth. That's where this thing is going.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement with you. And I believe, I don't know how old you who are watching are, but specifically, Lee, I really believe that for teenagers up to 30 and 40-year-old people who very well could be here and see the actual return of Jesus, they're targets right now. They're targets of the enemy to turn their hearts away from Israel. They're targets of the enemy to live lives that are less than the Lord would desire for them to live. So as you're speaking, I'm thinking about that generation. And I love that you're seeing a shift and a change where they're concerned, because they're the ones that are coming after us. They're the ones that are going to be calling the watchmen forth according to the word. So thank God for those. And may the ones who are really struggling where Israel is concerned and even their own salvation is concerned, listen, I don't know how old you are, but I really feel to encourage you. If God's not going to be silent where Israel's concerned, he's not going to be silent where you're concerned either. And the Lord loves you. He loves you with an everlasting love. Come under his authority and his submission. He's got a role for you to play in the end time purposes of God. And I know that you're involved in so many things where you're seeing young people come together, crying out to the Lord. That impressed me when I was with you, walking into a room, seeing people, most of whom were younger than I, crying out for the salvation of Israel. I love it.
Yeah. And if you look at modern seminaries, that's really the birthplace of replacement theology, is in modern seminaries. And what we need is in churches and in schools of ministry, like we have a Radiant School of Ministry. We're shifting that focus. And what's happening is eyes are opening up when they're reading the Bible going, oh, you mean when I'm reading in the Old Testament and I say, it says Judah, that's not the church? Oh, that really is Judah? Or that God really has a promise? All of a sudden the lights go on and they begin to realize, no, this is something going on. One thing I want to point out, Scott, in verse 6, 7, and 8 is when God says, on your walls, O Jerusalem, I've set watchmen, and it's day and night. This is military language. The reason why you put watchmen on the wall is to defend against the encroachment of the enemy. And I think as much as these verses are speaking about at the end of the age, God's kind intentions, it also reveals in a very subtle way the enemy's intention. That the enemy has strategies to bring disaster, division, hatred against the Jewish people and against the nation of Israel. And that is the storm that we're beginning to see that you spoke of. You said, I've never seen more hatred. It's true. There are places in Germany right now that if you're Jewish, they tell you not to go to anymore. Because that same thing from 80 years ago is beginning. It's like a weed that got cut off at the surface. It's beginning to sprout again. And whether it's here in the American church, the boycotting of Israel, the UN, I mean, different things like this, we need to realize this is a spiritual battle, and it has to be dealt with spiritual weapons. Paul says the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. So this is beyond just political. This is the politics of heaven. This is a spiritual battle. And this is a clarion call to the church to stand on the wall and to pray and intercede and to defend Israel. That's what this is.
I love it. When we see that our role is one of praying and protecting, that our prayers actually form this shield that we don't even...
An iron dome.
An iron dome. I love it. I love it. We've only got about a minute before we have to close this segment, and then we'll finish up in the next one, or maybe two more or 10 more, however long you want to go. But I want to encourage you. If Israel is so important to the heart of God, then you know that the enemy is going to do everything he can to keep you from fulfilling your role where Israel is concerned. And as we're opening up the scriptures, I want you to just ask the Lord, Father, have I been blinded myself to what your heart is to where Israel is concerned? And I want to encourage you to pray, even as we talked about earlier, either in the last segment or maybe in this one, that whether or not you have a burden to pray for Israel, start praying. Whether or not you have a burden in your heart to see them saved, ask the Lord to give you his burden. He wants to share it with you so that we can together fulfill his purposes and one day see all Israel saved.